Chapter 2. During the period 1930 to 1932, I lived a rather solitary existence. I had found a job as a combination file clerk and French translator, and was able to live on my small weekly salary. It was in the fall of 1931 that I came into contact with a group of about 25 people who constituted the so-called Chicago Gurdjieff group. Although I came to know most of them personally and attended their group meetings, I found it difficult to understand their interest in Gurdjieff. They seemed to me to have been attracted to his teaching for a variety of not very good reasons, because of loneliness or perhaps because they considered themselves misfits or outcasts. Most of them had dabbled in the arts, theosophy, the occult, or something of the sort, and had come to Gurdjieff as if in a search of another cure for their life problems or whatever nature. Gurdjieffian theory, whatever it might be, seemed acceptable to them precisely because it was difficult to define, while Gurdjieff himself had always made sense to me as an individual. I had not had much contact with his theories when I had been at the Priory. These theories, as presented and discussed by the Chicago group, were a total mystery to me. I began to sense a certain danger in his teaching when it was carried on without his personal supervision. My more or less unconscious exposure to Gurdjieff's ideas while I was at the Priory had given me some ideas of my own. I thought of his teaching as something that was intended to stimulate interest in personal development, but certainly not as a philosophy that had any bearing on or any interest in the everyday problems of people. It did not pretend to answer questions or offer solutions to existing difficulties, but, or so it seemed to me, suggested the possibility of a new way of life, a way of acquiring new values and a new morality. How this was accomplished was another question, and I had learned not to ask about that. The meetings in Chicago generally consisted of reading of Gurdjieff's first book, which purported to be, in his own words, an objective, impartial criticism of the life of man, and these readings were usually followed by a discussion period during which these followers seemed to me to attempt to relate his writings to their own individuality. Since the writings were obviously critical of ordinary values, standards, and social morality, the group members usually interpreted these criticisms as meaning that any values which ran counter to the prevailing morality were worthwhile. With this view of life, such things as free love, adultery, or any radical social behavior became also automatically justified. In other words, while Gurdjieff seemed to me to offer a means of acquiring a new point of view towards life through work and personal struggles, the prevailing attitude of this particular group of followers was that of substituting new values for old by rote, without any consideration of the means. No attempt was made to acquire, through conscious effort, a new perspective. They behaved as if it were possible simply to decide that they had, overnight, acquired them in their sleep, much as if they had, without any effort whatsoever, suddenly ceased to need to smoke cigarettes. One of the major differences for me between this group and the adults who had presumably been involved in the same sort of work at the Priory was that these people were all Americans and most of them had never been to the Priory. The strictly American nature of the group was impressed upon me through the question of morality. Europeans, at least the Europeans I had known in France and at the Priory, appeared to think of morality as a code of behavior, covering general human activity, including, among a great many other things, sexual activity. To these Americans, or for that matter most other Americans with whom I had any contact, morality was confined to sexual codes, and extended perhaps as far as table manners, but no further. Having had, up to that point in my life, no sexual experience, I was both surprised by and unprepared for this kind of morality. It came as a distinct surprise to me, therefore, to learn that a good deal of the interest in Gurdjieff seemed to be based on the assumption that life at the Priory must have been indiscriminately free, meaning licentious. I knew, of course, that Gurdjieff himself was the father of some illegitimate children. I also knew, however, that Gurdjieff, contrary to the opinions of these and other people, quite frankly impose restrictions upon his disciples that he did not impose upon himself. He would have been the first person to tell you that he was extraordinary, in the sense that he was not bound by average behavioral rules. Once I had begun to comprehend this American morality, I understood why such of the discussion following the book readings was concerned with such questions as free love, etc. The book itself did not, in my opinion, even go into such subjects, but it did lend itself to interpretation of all kinds. Although these readings left me almost completely in the dark, for the simple reason that it was a difficult book to read and required complete attention and concentration on the part of the reader or listener, there was enough comprehensible material in it to hold my interest and to make me begin to think about the man and his work in a different way than I had before. When the book is read as a straightforward criticism of man's history on the planet Earth, it can have a stimulating, thought-provoking effect, and I doubt that this first book was intended as anything more than a critique. In general, although it suggests that there are solutions to the human dilemma, it does not actually do much more in that direction than so further suggest that there are means which lead to solutions. No actual solutions or answers are given. So much of the criticism in the book is new or radical that it was difficult, if not impossible, to argue against it. In order to retain an interest in the Gurdjieff work, one had to accept his view of life, in the same sense that it would, I presume, be necessary to have faith in order to become a genuine, honest follower of, say, the Catholic religion. The group members genuinely managed to avoid the dilemma of this faith or commitment by the rather simple expedient of deciding that the Gurdjieff writings were primarily allegorical and therefore subject to whatever interpretation they chose to give them. It was rather like getting married without benefit of a license or a ceremony. I was still young enough to read such a simple statement as the fact that constipation was the universal disease, particularly of Americans because the toilet seats were too comfortable, and accept it as a meaning nothing more than what it said. I could understand someone arguing that constipation was not a universal disease, but I could not understand it when some group member asserted that Gurdjieff did not mean constipation in the usual sense, but rather something emotional or mental. In fact, while the style in which the book is written seems enormously complicated, at least on first reading, the complexity seems to me to be an attempt at absolute precision and calculated to avoid the possibility of any interpretation of or double meaning. When the book states that man as such does not have a soul, but only has the rather faint possibility of acquiring one, I think the statement is literal, and I further assume that Gurdjieff's assertion that in order to acquire a soul it would be necessary to work, preferably with Gurdjieff, towards this aim, means quite simply what it says. I do not, of course, mean that any reader was compelled to agree with such a statement, but I do not feel that it means anything else. I, personally, find the statement acceptable, and am not concerned with whether any other person believes it. My only argument would be with those who assume that it contains a separate or allegorical meaning. Among other things, Gurdjieff, along with accepted religions, seemed to say that one should love one's enemies, i.e. not have any enemies, and it did not seem to me that such a statement was open to question. The problem, if there was a problem, might lie in the interpretation of the word love. Gurdjieff's own definition of it, to know enough to be able to help others, even when they could not help themselves, was good enough for me and had only one meaning. By and large, the Chicago group fitted in with other Gurdjieff disciples I had known, people who were content to take on certain ritualistic, physical attitudes which lacked any inner content. After a short period of association with Gurdjieff and exposure to his writings, people frequently changed the outer expression of themselves and were given to affectations in speech and dress, usually intended to express reverence. One element that was conspicuously lacking in most of Gurdjieff's followers was the one element which he himself expressed abundantly: humor. In consequence, the meetings were charged with an atmosphere of grim, humorless devotion, and a consequent lack of perspective. It seemed to me that if we are as idiotic and unformed as Gurdjieff depicts us to be, it is particularly impossible to see ourselves objectively without a sense of the ridiculous. The very posturing and attitudinizing of the group members was evidence of a certain misplaced seriousness. While it was obvious that any solution to the human predicament would involve serious hard work, the contemplation of ordinary human behavior was not without its ridiculous aspects. The spectacle of a group of adult human beings discussing in hushed tones their weaknesses, sins, and general fallibility certainly had its humorous side to me, perhaps particularly because I was one of the group.